will stop now, and I will go a little bit in deep on Talanoa dialogue and guiding principle after. And now I let the floor to Grammenos Mastrojeni, that is here with us. Thank you for Grammenos for being here. Grammenos, as I said, is an Italian diplomat that now is active in the Union for Mediterranean. So, Grammenos, the floor is yours. I don't spend any other words. The floor is yours, and thank you very much for being here.
Thanks to you all, my friends. Talanoa, we are all on the same boat, absolutely all on the same boat. And I hope that you can hear me well. This is a forum of societies, which is absolutely fundamental, because for too many years we've thought that the solution was in the hands of only of governments or of some superior power. The solution is basically in our hands, and it must be pursued, also keeping in mind that we do not have to save climate for the sake of climate, but that climate is essential for justice, for a better world, for a world of peace. To understand this, we have to start a little bit from basics. There is a value we don't really care about. There are some days in our year in which we express some good intentions for our future. Basically, it's New Year's Eve or the day of our birthday. But I would be surprised if anyone among you, unless there are some Zen Buddhists among us, on New Year's Eve expresses as a good intention for his year to be in balance. We have other priorities. We want to grow, we want to become better, we want to become richer, we want to develop. Balance, we don't care. Forgetting that without balance, any of those objectives that are so important to us become impossible to attain. Let us imagine I am a young kid and that my good intention for the coming year would be to become a better soccer player. I prepare my training schedule and I take balance for granted until the minute in which balance goes away. For instance, because I break my leg. If I break my leg, there's nothing to be done. I will never be able to become a better football player, at least until it lasts, because my physiological balance went away. Now this necessity, basic necessity for balance is true in all aspects of our life, and it is true also in our relationship with Mother Earth. We are who we are. We are at the point in progress that we know today because Mother Earth has given us balance, without which organizing human society is impossible. Balance and natural cycles give us something which is absolutely essential for us, which is predictability in the cycles of nature and in the time in which its fruits will be delivered. It is only because our planet is in balance that we know that there will be spring at springtime with its characteristics. If Earth was only chaotic, no predictable cycles, no balance that harnesses all the casuality of planet Earth, nothing that we do today would be possible. For instance, how can a farmer plan its seeding and its harvest if there is absolutely no notion of when rainfall will arrive? It's impossible, but it's not only a rural problem. How can the manager of water distribution in a big city plan the distribution if he has absolutely no idea of rainfall or snowfall on the mountains where the water comes from? It is impossible. We need to rely on a planet Earth that gives us, according to certain predictable cycles, some fundamental services that we still rely on. And these services have a clock, and this clock is called climate. Climate regulates the services of Mother Earth to us. It is so important and it's not difficult to understand. Still, we don't care about it. And the reason why we don't care about it is basically an economical reason. One that we understand well if we consider that we are ready to pay $1,000 an ounce of gold, but we would never pay $1,000 for an ounce of air, the air we breathe. An ounce of air is for free. What does it mean? It means that we give value to goods, services, whatever, not based on their objective usefulness, but based on a perception of scarcity. And this is the reason why we never gave value to balance, because Mother Earth floods us with balance. Individually, with the exception of some less fortunate people, we are all born with physiological balance. We're all born with psychological balance. But also in the relationship with our common home, well, Mother Earth flooded it with balance, and together with balance, predictability. And this was particularly true starting 10,000 years ago, because the last remnants of the last ice age ended, and a new era started in which, on one hand, climate was mild. On the other hand, climate became predictable. It acted in balance according to predictable cycles. It was only in this condition of predictability that we went through the most fundamental revolution of our history, which was not the Industrial Revolution. It was the agricultural revolution. It happened 10,000 years ago, not because at that time more intelligent human beings appeared, but because at that time conditions created to start agriculture, which meant shifting from being users of the ecosystem to organizers of the ecosystem. Somehow it's managers. Without that, current society, the way we know it, which is still based on the agricultural revolution that divides us in cities and rural lands and natural landscapes, wouldn't be there. So we have to preserve this balance. It is absolutely essential. We only realize it's missing when it's missing, because normally we have it. I told you that in the last 10,000 years, mankind was lucky enough to benefit from a very abundant natural balance, but it was not the same all over the place. Maybe some of you is listening from Mexico, or maybe some of you have visited Mexico. Well, in Mexico, there is a place that tells us the whole story of how important balance is. If you go to Mexico, generally you go and visit Yucatan, this wonderful peninsula, not only because of its fabulous beaches, but also because of its fantastic archaeological sites. The most well-known of which is Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza is a very complex and refined location. It used to be a ceremonial city, and all the marvelous buildings that you can admire there, pyramids and palaces, actually revolve around an altar, a stone altar where human sacrifices were practiced. Not only human sacrifices, but every year, the equivalent of the winners of the soccer championship or of the Super Bowl were actually sacrificed there. A bunch of young people who were very popular. They were the champions of a very popular sport among the Mayas. But instead of receiving as a prize the millions or billions that are champions to receive, as a prize they received to be laid on an altar and slain in a rather cruel way. If we ask ourselves, what were the Mayas demanding from the gods to get to the point of slaying young people and sport champions? The answer in modern language would be that they were looking for balance. They were asking the gods to give balance. That is, they were asking the gods to have rainfall at the expected time, to have spring at the expected time. But why did it happen there? Because the Mayas were particularly cruel? For sure not. We, the Europeans, have been extremely cruel throughout history. The reason is that balance could not be taken for granted so much in that area. Because if you see Mexico, it stays in the middle of climate fluctuations that we have all heard about. It's El Nino, La Nina, kind of regular, but not so much. And it is comprehensible that if you organize your society in the middle of a nature that it is not so predictable, then it becomes so important to have fertility when you require it, to have stability in the way climate behaves so that you can plan your agriculture, that you can get to the point of human sacrifices. So I hope I managed to convince you that balance, although we don't care about it, is a fundamental aspect of our life and that we have to protect it. If you agree with me, we have to understand a little bit about this balance. There are so many things to be said about balance, but at least one has to be underlined in this context. That is that the balance we're talking about, it's a global balance. And it's global in two senses. It is geographically global. It means that you cannot have the illusion to protect your balance, your favorable balance around yourself in your own region or spot if there is chaos outside. So this is one first hint of the fact that Mother Earth requires justice from us. Because if you live in your golden tower, let's say the European Union that perfectly achieves its Green Deal, but everything around it is crumbling down, there will be no Green Deal even for the European Union because there will be so many imported costs out of instability that there will be no means to attain the noble and fantastic objectives of the European Union. By the way, you cannot dream of protecting your own balance from chaos outside by building a wall, because our planet is governed also by the butterfly effect. It means that the mere fluttering of a butterfly in Japan could be the first event of a series of events that can transform into a hurricane in Florida. But it also means that the poverty of a young kid in Ethiopia, for instance, could be the first event of a series of events that could lead someone to put a bomb on the flight that you're traveling on. So we need to be aware that there are no differences in this planet between far and near. My tribe, other tribes. And I believe that all the people who are listening to this small talk are already convinced about this. We all feel local, but still we have to pay attention to some atavical instincts that give us the illusion that we are thinking local, but we are actually always thinking local. I'll give you an example. In 2009, two psychologists in Utah University ran an experiment with their students. They divided them in two groups and had them undergo the same procedure with one variation. So the first group, they told that they were living in a city 80 miles away from a nuclear plant that exploded. And then they projected images and films of the aftermath of the fallout and this kind of things. Second group, exactly the same thing, same story, same images, but in the story there was one small difference. They were told that they were not living 80 miles away from the nuclear plant, but only 20 miles away, except that this plant was located across the border. Then they measured the levels of anxiety of both groups to discover that those who were told that the plant actually burst in their face, but it was across the border, expressed a notably lesser level of anxiety. What does it mean? It cannot mean that students at Utah University are all idiots, of course. Actually, they were PhDs. So it means that even PhDs, even those who volunteer for climate, even people like me have been working with this for 30 years. If I don't pay attention to inner instincts, I will be always tempted to refer only to what's around me. This is called border bias, and this is the remnant of some instincts that were created in the age in which everything that counted for us concerned our tribe. Now the tribe has changed name. It's called city, it's called region, it's called state, but still the mechanism is the same. We resist to geographical globality of balance, but we also resist to another aspect of this globality, which is systemic globality. What does it mean? It means that we live in a system in which everything is interconnected with everything. And this is hard to accept for someone, especially if he was born and educated in the West. And here again, there is an economic reason, which is very interesting. You know, the West had tens of centuries of accelerated development and expansion. But economically, it started to really fly higher during at least 2 centuries, around the 1700s. And there is a reason to that, which is not the fact that someone theorized the free market. The free market was already there, and those who theorized it only described in rigorous terms reality. This was Adam Smith. But shortly after Adam Smith, another English economist called David Ricardo introduced something new, which is systematic specialization. Since we systematically started to specialize in our economic life, we started to perform what has appeared better. Today it's a disaster, the result, but during 2 centuries, through specialization and advanced specializations, the Western world became richer. And this had economical impacts, but it also left a cultural scar. In our world, whatever is not specialized tends to be considered not serious. You know, do you remember the old 360-degree doctor we used to visit? Maybe the younger generations here don't even remember it. Yeah. Doctors in the countryside who would tell you, please come in. And then after you move 2 steps, they would tell you, you know, you have a problem on the left eye. And you would be surprised and said, how do you know that? It's because you're clinging on the right leg, and so on. This holistic approach we have abandoned, but we need to get back to it, and in a serious and rigorous way, because we live in a world in which everything is interconnected with everything. Our balance is global, not only geographically, but also systemically. For instance, we live in a world in which, and I wonder which textbook tells it, beheadings are connected with volcanoes. Sometimes I ask my students to tell me the first things that come into their mind if I say French Revolution. And many of them just reply, Marie Antoinette brioche. What textbook tells that 5 years before the French Revolution, an eruption, a volcanic eruption, started in Iceland that filled the sky with particulate ashes. The ashes in turn blocked sunlight, and this caused in turn a couple of seasons that were particularly cold in Central Europe, especially in France. This in turn caused a failed harvest, actually various failed harvests. So people started starving, and it was in this context that Marie Antoinette talked about her brioche and the bread. So if you agree with me that balance is important, we have to take control of it, considering that it's global in the sense that every sector influences every sector. There is one way we can do that, and it was the way chosen by the United Nations. You can do that with a sort of rigorous approach by building a matrix of all the sub-balances that are interconnected and that all together concur to grant global balances. And you can imagine matrices at various levels of complexity. For instance, you could imagine a matrix that has one case devoted to the Pinatubo volcano that undergoes an eruption, connected with the matrix devoted to agricultural productivity in Asia that suffers because of the eruption, connected to a matrix that concerns Wall Street trends that start to crumble because of what happened with Asian agriculture, connected with a case that concerns my own T. Josephine, who had invested everything in Wall Street, loses everything and commits suicide. Of course, we do not have the means to manage such a complex matrix. Not only we do not have computational power, but also we have not understood all these relationships to this level of complexity. So we need to resort to use a much simpler matrix, and this is the one that I'm presenting you in the slide. One that tells us that there is a dynamic relationship between environment, development, human rights, and peace. I'll give you an example. Imagine an environmental happening, like a drought. A drought does not stay only in the sector of environment. It immediately has impacts on development or economy, whatever you want to call it, because there is a failed harvest. And if this happens in a rich country, well, normally the passage stops there. Because in rich countries, farmers have enough protections not to make it more than an economic tragedy. But if this happens, for instance, in a poor country, let's say in the Sahel, in the Africa Sahel, to an African small farmer, then the connections continue to work because an economic problem can easily become a human rights problem. For instance, when a failed harvest makes the difference between sending or not sending your children to school. But take a family, an individual, submitted to uncertainty about the behavior of its territory, uncertainty about its economical future, compression of its basic rights, and there you have the recipe of conflict. It's very simple. What will he do? He has to feed his family. The farm doesn't allow it anymore, but around there are some employers that pay a very good salary and they are drug traffickers. Or maybe they are Boko Haram, a terrorist group. So you see how these things are interconnected, but they are interconnected coherently. Something bad about the environment will affect economy in the wrong way and will affect human rights in the wrong way. The whole resulting into a threat to peace and stability. Also, the contrary is true, and it is our hope. Something good about environment will not be a generous gesture towards Mother Earth that will be a cost for the rest of our interests. Something good we do for the environment will transform into better and faster development, better protection of human rights, enhanced justice. And all this seems so obvious, but the truth is that we organized our lives according to a totally different principle. We always thought that among these four sectors, and actually among these four values, there was no coherence. There was the contrary. There was a trade-off, a tension, a competition. And among those four values, we had elected development, that is wealth, as most important. The one value in the name of which we could afford to sacrifice the other three values. For instance, we always thought that there is a trade-off between wealth and human rights. And this is why we justified sending 12 years old little guys into mines, coal mines, working 14 hours, and it didn't happen in a faraway corner of planet Earth. It happened in England at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and we tended to justify it as something necessary to get into the Industrial Revolution. But it does not only belong to the past. Whenever we transfer an industrial plant to a country in which you can afford to pay almost nothing unprotected labor, maybe child labor, or exploit women, we are doing the same. And we tend to think it's justified in the name of wealth and development. Of course, we always thought that there is a trade-off between development and peace. Most wars have economic reasons, and the whole adventure of colonization was according to this idea. I can afford to get into war and cruelty because it's necessary for development. And basically, we think there is a fundamental trade-off between development and the environment. And unfortunately, this is also the outlook of many environmental groups. What we think is that, in principle, as rational beings, we have an infinite potential for development, but unfortunately, we live on a planet that has finite resources. This is completely wrong. The truth is that if we protect the environment, our development doesn't suffer. Our development, our wealth, our growth is enhanced. So I would like you to keep in mind this very small matrix, because what we are going to do, by the way, this matrix is the root matrix of another matrix you've probably seen, which is the 2030 agenda of the United Nations. What we're briefly going to do is to put it in motion. First, in the scenario in which we don't care about the environment, and what I'm going to describe is what is happening right now. We have entered a gigantic feedback loop among those four sectors that grows and grows and grows and becomes faster and faster and faster in disruption. And it's easy to understand through climate change. But climate change is just an example. Whenever we harm the balance of Mother Earth, its potential, its health, we do something. This situation is well described by this scheme. This is an old version, but you're all familiar with it. It's the planetary boundaries. You know, a team of scientists led by the Swedish scientist Rockström investigated the impacts of mankind on natural resources, and the synthesis of the synthesis of the synthesis of their results is described in this graph that basically identifies 9 areas in which we are affecting Mother. Say the gravity of the situation is described by the amplitude of the red portions of the triangles. 3 triangles are in areas in which we have gone absolutely beyond Mother Earth regeneration capacity. The triangle concerning climate change is the one pointing upwards. Apparently, is not the worst sector. There are other 2 sectors in which we've gone far beyond Mother Earth's regeneration capacity. One is the nitrogen cycle, too technical to talk about here. But there is another one which is easy to understand. It concerns biodiversity. But I'm not telling you this to say, well, you know, we're here fighting for climate, but remember that there is something worse than climate. No, I'm here to say that all these things are interconnected, that we have built a gigantic feedback loop that feeds on itself. For instance, climate change affects biodiversity because it shrinks forests. But this puts in motion a feedback loop. A shrinking forest actually enhances in turn climate change, because soils that were absorbing carbon there where the forest was growing, once they desertify, actually they start emitting carbon. So the cause enhances a cause that reverts on a cause. There are 11 very threatening nature-to-nature, ecosystem-to-ecosystem feedback loops that are starting to become dangerous right now, and that promise, if untamed, to make us shift very quickly towards a global average increase in temperature above 4 degrees, which is simply incompatible with human society as we know it. But there is another reason why I am talking about biodiversity. Is because when we protect soils, when we protect climate, when we protect climate, actually what we're doing, what we have in mind is to protect biodiversity. Biodiversity is the real value we have to take care of. Biodiversity is the collection of services without which we just cannot exist as human beings. Without biodiversity, we cannot eat. Without biodiversity, our waters will not be purified, and so on and so forth. Actually, what is happening is that we are in this strange situation. This graph shows the species extinction in the last 50 years, and it has taken a very steep curve, a hockey stick curve. We are losing species at a rate which is considered between 100 and 1,000 times faster than ordinary period. And naturalists call this period the sixth biotic transition, which is the complicated word to say the sixth mass extinction. The fifth one happened roughly 65 million years ago, and as they used to say, which is not precise, it wiped out the dinosaurs. Well, if we stay exactly on the climate trend that we are now, not if we go in a worst scenario, it is forecasted that by the end of the century, 8 species out of 10 will be lost, which is exactly the result of the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. It ended up wiping out 8 species out of 10. And this is why naturalists say that we are in a mass extinction episode. But they also add that this is different from any before. It is different because it is the first time that one being, one species, is causing it all. And it is different because it seems that it is the fastest ever mass extinction ever witnessed. And one could be surprised, because if we think of the asteroid, we are kind of induced to think that the asteroid caused an instantaneous extinction. We watched those documentaries showing the big stone from space colliding with Earth, big explosion, big crater, a shock wave, and we come out with the impression that in a couple of hours the whole tragedy was consumed, but that's not true. The asteroid was the first event of a series of events that ended up in the extinction of 8 species out of 10, but it lasted at least 30,000 years. Well, we humans, if we keep in the same path, we will be able to do the same in 200 years, since the onset of the Industrial Revolution until the end of this century. And so why should we care so much? I mean, are we so sad, so sorry for the loss of beauty that we will have? Well, it's not only a question of beauty, although beauty is important. It's not only a question of compassion, it is a question of our own interests. The real story is told better than by any scientist or professor by this anonymous guy who painted this murales some 5 years ago in London. It talks about bees. Bees showing us, excuse me, they're flying away and just telling us when we go, we are taking you all with us. We cannot survive without bees. We need them. Bees and pollinating arthropods. 60% of them are threatened by extinction. Someone has even calculated the economic value of bees, $3,250 per acre per year. And this is a stupid calculation because it only concerns agriculture. But bees do not only pollinate our farms, they also pollinate the forests around the farm, without which there would be no farm because the forests collect the water. So what happens is that whenever we lose an element of this balance, we don't only lose its presence and its beauty, we also lose the function it performs to maintain the rest of the balance. And without this balance, as we've seen, we could not exist. You know, bees still, we can see them, but what would we say about these little tiny beings? These little things are called plankton and phytoplankton. They are threatened by a phenomenon that scientists call the brother of climate change, which is ocean acidification. Actually, scientists called it the wicked brother of climate change. You know, 1/3 of the excess carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere is absorbed by the oceans. There, it transforms into carbonic acid. And many of these little tiny beings have a skeleton, which is a skeleton made of calcium, and it is well known that acid is dangerous for calcium. Whenever you have to clean your shower from calcium incrustations, you use vinegar, which is an acid. They are so tiny that even a small difference into the acidity of the ocean could make a difference. So far, the fact that we are acidifying our oceans more and more is making the lives of these little beings more difficult. But then we will get to a point in which the situation changes completely and suddenly. From difficult, it becomes impossible. There will be no more plankton reproduction. And so, who cares? I mean, I'm not SpongeBob, and plankton has not stolen any recipe of mine. I don't go to dinner with plankton, yes, but if plankton goes extinct, the basis of marine life disappears, and together with it, the whole of marine life, or a good part of it, will be extinct. Well, why should I care? I live on land, yes, but 12% of the world's population lives on biological sea production. 12% doesn't seem so threatening, but 17% of the proteins that the whole of mankind eats comes from the ocean. 17% is 1/5, and it starts to be disquieting, but not so much. I can still eat chicken, but 55% of the oxygen we breathe comes from marine life. So if we let this thing happen, we will soon find ourselves in a situation in which we will be available to pay 1 ounce of hair more than 1 ounce of gold. We are facing these feedback loops, but they're not the worst. There are other feedback loops. Mankind, ecosystem, mankind, which are more dangerous because climate change and natural disruption threatens us. The mechanism can be understood observing the story of this guy that you all recognize called Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, we cannot say that he was the culprit of the Second World War, but he gave a good hand for sure. But why are we talking about Adolf Hitler? Because through the observation of what happened to him, a giant leap forward in the understanding of the nature of peace was made, at least by policy makers. This is because Adolf Hitler did not go to power through violence. He was freely elected to the parliament in 1933. And what was really surprising is that he was freely elected by the most cultivated population in the world between the two wars, especially by the German middle class. Why did they do that? Now we know. I mean, it is a common wisdom that it was not because they were especially, inclined to this kind of action, but it was because they were undergoing a severe social and economic stress. And the 1929 crisis, summed with other historical factors, led the German middle class into taking irrational decisions and aggressive options. But this is a general rule. We've seen it before. It's the situation in which the African farmer that has nothing more to give to his kids to eat, well, he has to join Boko Haram or this kind of situation. Well, climate change is acting exactly in this way because it asserts a severe social and economic pressure. I'll give you a small example of the tragedies we can face in the future if we don't take the future in your hands, remembering something we've just touched upon when we talked about plankton. These things do not happen gradually in proportion with the temperature increase. Let's say that the temperature increases and you have the first hints that something could happen, and then beyond a certain point, the situation changes. There is a paradigm shift, a tipping point, and the consequences came out altogether fastly and suddenly. And this is important because if everything happened gradually and proportionally, you would have time to understand and prepare. But if everything happens massively and at once, you don't have that time and you find yourself unprepared. Well, the same thing that could happen with plankton, beyond a certain point, plankton disappears, could happen with glaciers. Glaciers are doomed if we continue this way. But what is really dangerous is that they will not keep thawing, melting gradually in proportion with the global increase in temperature, but beyond a certain temperature, they will collapse. I don't have time to explain the mechanism, but believe me, And if I say this to someone in Europe or someone in the United States, they will look at me with some sort of concern or maybe grief and sorrow for the loss of the landscape, of the local cultures. But basically what they're thinking is, okay, so it's none of my problem, this is far away. Maybe they forget that the Roman empires a long time ago, when there were no planes and no motorized vehicles, crumbled not only because of its internal problems, but also because of migrations coming from Central Asia due to a period of particular cold. But anyway, what happens if glaciers crumble? Well, the same thing that happens with bees. It's not only their beauty that disappears, it's also their function towards the rest of the balance that disappear. Glaciers perform a lot of functions towards our fantastic balance, but there is one which is absolutely essential for human beings. They are the regulators of an orderly output of water towards the valleys. If glaciers crumble, consider the south of the Himalaya. It is a very vast and populated area that has a monsonic climate. It means that a very dry season alternates with a very humid season. So what do glaciers do? They retain the excess humidity during the wet season and release it gradually during the dry season to a system of rivers that irrigates plains where 1.4 billion people are located. If glaciers crumble, those people will have to manage the unmanageable, an alternance of floods and droughts that will destroy their harvest, will destroy their roads, their hospitals, and things like that. To say nothing of the tragedy of the people in the mountains. 913 million people exposed in very fragile ecosystems. But this is another story. Let's just stick to what happens in the plains. Well, put on the plates of the scales objectively. 20 million members of the German middle class stressed by the loss of the value of the money, and 500 million people stressed by something which is objectively worse than that. You lose your rice, you lose your water, you lose your school, your health, and add to this cocktail the fact that in this area, 4 states, India, China, Pakistan, and Russia have nukes, and Houston, we have a problem. But I'm not here to forecast the end of the world. My job is not Nostradamus. We can still do a lot to avoid these scenarios, which are not on in the future. They're already happening. They're already affecting us. And by the way, they affect the poor. This is the point. I'm showing you a map of the northernmost portion of Africa, which is mainly composed of deserts that have been deserts using thousands of years. The desert is not a generous ecosystem, but still there are people that have found a way to live in the ecosystem of the desert. Except that today we don't not only have the desert, we also have an active zone that basically overlaps the Sahel. This is the area of desertification. If you put, again, objectively on the plates of the scale, the generosity of the ecosystem in the deep desert and in the area of desertification, the latter remains more generous in absolute terms. But in this area, climate has stopped obeying the cycles. It's imbalance that is operating, unpredictability. 1.5 years ago, I was in Mali, and farmers were panicking, not because there was lack of water, but because it was raining before the forecasted period, and their planned harvests were already ruined. So this has become the area of uncertainty about the behavior of nature. You see where it's located, you might notice that it overlaps the area of concentration of hunger and conflicts, of terrorist dynamics, of illegal trafficking, and the area from which those cruel so-called migrations, actually forced movements of population, mostly start from. What I'm talking about is a feedback loop, which is much worse than the nature-to-nature feedback loop. What happens is that environmental stress, when it hits poor communities, it makes them crumble. The social cohesion collapse and they get into conflict. But if they get into conflict, there is no more Talanoa dialogue. They have other priorities. They lose the possibility to mitigate and adapt. Their environment becomes even worse, and so the loop restarts amplified. And again, environment equals justice. We might think, I'm so sorry for them. It's always the same. It's always the same poor people who suffer, but I am safe in my ivory tower in Europe or in the US or wherever. Well, this is strictly not true. If we don't stay below 2 degrees, we will have scenarios of mass extinction that will spare no one. There will be no more golden or ivory towers. But to stay below 2 degrees, we need everyone to cooperate. It's quantitatively impossible to stay below 2 or even better 1.5 degrees is if everyone is not on board, if we do not row on the same boat all together. For instance, because industrialized countries control roughly 65% of the economies, but developing countries control roughly 70% of surfaces, both land and sea surfaces. And if these surfaces are not managed in a sustainable way, there is no way to avoid the mass extinction that will wipe us too. So what is the message of Mother Earth? The message of Mother Earth is the poor first. Rush to protect the poor. Otherwise, it will be doomed for everyone. But this interconnection that is showing itself so destructive because it is coherent. The more you harm the environment, the more you harm the economy, the more you harm the economy, the more you harm human rights, and so on and so forth. Works also the other way around. And this is why, much more than what I've told you before, this is why environment equals justice. You want to solve climate change, you will not do it only with solar panels or electric cars. You will do it by building justice. Imagine putting solar panels on top of a school on a poor village. What is the contribution to solving the climate change crisis? 0.01% because it's more energy efficient. 99.99% because it gives instruction to kids. We need to build justice and put everyone in condition to row. And we can understand it through this relationship. What's good for you is good for your planet, both on the ecological and on the human dimensions. I'm showing you two pyramids. The first one is very well known. Sorry, it's an Italian. It's called the nutrition pyramid. It tells you in which proportion you should eat every category of food to be in good health. Basically, little red meat, a little more protein, animal proteins from other sources, but you have a healthy diet if you eat vegetables, fibers, fruits, and this kind of things. Now, if you couple this pyramid to another pyramid, which is the pyramid of the impact on the environment, of the production of each kind of food, you discover that the more a certain kind of food harms my health, if eaten excessively, the more its production harms the environment. And one would say, wow, what a coincidence in the sector of nutrition, except that it's not a coincidence and it works in every sector. You can try browsing your own pyramid of personal transportation and you will discover that it's exactly the same. The more your transportation choices, as far as possible, protect your health, your wallet, your socialization, the more they tend to be sustainable. And I mean, I have an open bet for someone to find me a sector in which this is not true. And this is fantastic. It's just the result of the fact that we co-evolved together with the system. So it is only normal that the best behavior for our health and well-being is also the behavior which is compatible with the system, because we evolved together. So we need to be in tune. But it kind of launches an individual message. You've got nothing to lose to mobilize into a sustainable way of life. Maybe you don't care about the planet, but anyway, it's better for you because you live better. But this is not only an individual thing. It has huge global and geostrategic implications. Let us imagine that the rich world started eating according to the nutrition pyramids in a healthier way. First effect, a great diminution in taxes. Because you see, this system, this unjust system that is destroying nature is also destroying our wallet. Out of it, we have not created abundance. Yes, we have created abundance in principle. We have enough calories to feed 11 billion people right now. So we should not fear becoming 9.5 billion in a few years. But what we have created is a polarization between 1.5 obese people with connected diseases and 874 undernourished people. This is cruel, but we can solve it while we solve the protection of nature if only we respect ourselves. If we eat correctly in a way that makes us feel better, we will stop paying the huge tax proportion which is due to taking care of those 1.5 billion people who have diseases due to wrong or excessive eating, and the cost is estimated equivalent to the GDP of the seventh richest nation on earth, which, by the way, happens to be Italy. It's the whole GDP of Italy that will be taken away from our taxes first. But at the same time, since there is less impact on nature, we become more sustainable. But becoming more sustainable is not only a gift for nature. It also means that we liberate resources to be kept there so that we don't overtake from nature. No, that's not the point. Because we're not overtaking from nature in absolute. What we're doing is that we are polarizing places where we take too much, we produce too much, and we do it in an industrial way, and places which are left without nothing. If we had an agriculture which was distributed fairly all over the world, with social and local sovereignty on resources, on natural resources, we would have a much richer gastronomic landscape, the contribution of all traditions, and above all, we would have local food sovereignty, which is the basis of all self-determination mechanisms. So let's recap. I decide to protect myself by eating better. This makes me more sustainable, but if I am more sustainable, what am I doing? I'm giving up the excess, which is harmful for me, and making it available for those who need exactly the same thing. And you might think that I'm making it easy and that I'm making it simple, but no, the system works like that. Imagine that we stopped participating to that system that boasts about selling 1 million hamburgers per minute. What are we doing? Not only we're protecting our health, but we are also destroying that chain that leads big corporations and rich states to buy huge expanses of land in poor countries, where the local populations become landless and affected. So we would retrieve from this mechanism of land grabbing, water grabbing, that would leave other people in fairer condition. We are giving them the excess that is harming us because they need it, and nobody's losing anything. I am respecting myself, my true nature, by eating better, transporting better, choosing better clothes. This protects the environment, but transforms also in a redistribution towards those who need that excess, which is harmful for me. So in the end, we are getting to discover that we belong to a quite strange system, one in which the matrix, which is a mathematical instrument I showed you before, is solved by an equation that tells us that environment equals justice, equals development. That is, my well-being creates environmental protection that creates redistribution. But in the end, if you remember what we said about Adolf Hitler, war is not created by the personal psychopathy of dictators or things like that. It's created by the fact that people are under stress. If this is true, we create peace, because the planet in which every child can look confidently at the future, because his father farm will remain productive, is a planet in which no Al-Shabaab, no Boko Haram, no Nazi party will ever grow. Because when they arrive at the door of your farm on the truck saying, join the cause, you just tell them, I've got something better to do. Thank you so much, and wishing the social forum to have the greatest of impacts.
Thank you very much, Grammenos, for your wonderful, amazing, and inspiring speech. Thank you for being with us. We have also some questions. We have another guest today that unfortunately he cannot join physically, but he sent out a message, a video message to us. So let's see the message from Felipe Pino, that is one of the main animator and coordinator of the Manifesto Climatico Latinoamericano. And I saw that you have some questions, and you also make some questions into the chat. So let's hear for a bit. Maybe in the meanwhile that I'm preparing the video of Felipe Pino, take the chance also to have this round of questions. I saw, Grammenos, that there is one question in the chat. If you want to respond to that question in the meanwhile that I'm preparing the video.
What's the question? I mean, because the chat is very long.
Okay, no, I will read you. Is how about development? How development and environment go hand in hand?
Okay. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to reply to that. You know, some people think that we have to retrieve from well-being, economical well-being, because simply the ecosystem cannot afford it. But this is not true. Actually, we can only grow if our economy become green. And this was understood. Sorry, I thought that I had my black video to smoke my cigarette, but this was understood, for instance, by President Obama when he had to face the 2008 subprime crisis. Suddenly massive unemployment. He decided to react to it with an old recipe, the one that had been used also by President Roosevelt to cope with the 1929 crisis, that was injecting public money in the economy. So he adopted the so-called stimulus package, a huge amount of dollars, of federal dollars, pumped into the economy. But few people remember that his first proposal was not a stimulus package, an unqualified stimulus package, but a green stimulus package. That is, that this money had to be devoted to greening the economy. So why did he do that? Because he was concerned with the environment, for sure, but his first concern was employment and growth. And why then bet on greening of the economy? Well, I'll try to explain you this with an example. Imagine I'm the owner of a plant that produces prefabricated houses. If I only have to produce a prefabricated house, I can just rely on machines or on human beings reduced to machines, poorly paid, or, you know, something like that. In this case, what I'm doing, I am destroying the chance of growth of my system. And this was also detected by the US Treasury a few years before that. They talked about a bottleneck of the current economy. Because if you have a few people who have the producing and service power that make a lot of money, but then this money is not redistributed because everything is produced by machine, or the people who get paid very poorly, then they also destroy their own markets. There will be no more people able to buy their services and things like that. But if you have to do something which is green, like a green prefabricated house, all this is impossible. You cannot produce it without dignified, well-paid employment. Why? Because mass series production doesn't make sense anymore. a prefabricated house cannot be green in absolute. If you want to build a green prefabricated house, you have to calculate its location. You have to examine it. You have to know when it rains, when there is sunshine, or this kind of things. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. But this implies the input of the knowledge of people. Green economy is an economy which is in tune with a concrete territory, and this has to be understood, and only people can do that. What is the result? You make less prefabricated houses, but they are less expensive for those who own it, probably more durable, while you employ more people. So you redistribute the wealth, they enter more into the market, and this market starts to turn quicker and to grow. But how does it grow? It grows on quality, not on quantity. And this ends up making the GDP grow while you protect the environment, and you also protect the quality of your life. I understand that this was a very brief answer. It still leaves spaces to a lot of doubts, but otherwise I would have to become very, very technical, and I don't think that we have time and patience for that.